Welcome back to Parking Full Time. I'm Big Dave, the Parks Professor. And I want to specifically welcome you to this Bible study and prayer time. The goal of Parking Full Time is to display the glory of God's creation by exploring America one park at a time. The theme verse for Parking Full Time is Colossians 1:16. All things were created by Him and for Him. The hiking videos on this channel are designed to display the created by Him part, and these Bible study and prayer time videos explore the created for Him part. Right now we're studying through the Gospel of John, and in the previous video we studied the first part of John chapter 11. The key phrase in that verse is the one that I highlighted last time, as John chapter 11 and verse 25, where Jesus is speaking to his friend Martha here, and he tells her, "I am the resurrection and the life." I marked that, I put a 5 with a circle around it right over here, because that is the 5th of the 7 I am sayings in the Gospel of John. And in each of these sayings, when Jesus says, "I am such and such," he's invoking the name that God gave Moses back in Exodus chapter 3. That is, he's claiming that he's God. He's the same God that spoke to Moses back in Exodus and back in the first 5 books of the Bible. And when he says here, "I am the resurrection and the life," he's pointing out that only God has the power to take something that is dead and resurrect it, to take something that's dead and give it life again. So when he says, "I am the resurrection and the life," he's claiming that he's the God who has the power to make something that is dead alive. And he goes on to prove his claim in the most irrefutable and most public way possible. He goes to the tomb of his friend Lazarus, who has been dead for 4 days. He's as physically dead as anyone has ever been. And he tells him up here in verse 43, when he gets to Lazarus' tomb, he says, "And when he had thus spoken," when he prayed a prayer, Jesus prayed a prayer to his Father, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." And he that was dead, and that's Lazarus, came forth, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was bound about with a napkin. Jesus saith unto him, "Loose him, and let him go." So with this resurrection by bringing back Lazarus from the dead, Jesus proves in the most public, irrefutable way possible that he has the power that only God has, the power to give new life to the dead. Now, in the next block of text, the block that we're going to look at today, we're going to see 3 responses to this public, irrefutable proof of who Jesus is. So let's pick up where we left off last time. Let's start reading here in verse 45. It says, "Then many of the Jews which came to Mary and had seen the things which Jesus did believed on him. But some of them went their ways to the Pharisees and told them what things Jesus had done." Now, remember the Pharisees. We've seen them many times in this study. The Pharisees were among the Jewish leaders who wanted to kill Jesus. Even before Jesus gave the public, irrefutable proof of who he was earlier here in this chapter of raising Lazarus from the dead. And these people here in Jerusalem, them that went their ways to the Pharisees, they knew that. What they're really trying to do is they're trying to use this latest miracle to provoke the Pharisees to take action against Jesus. And so we get into the world of the Pharisees next. Look at verse 47 here. "Then gathered the chief priests and Pharisees a council." They got together in a meeting and said, "What do we? For this man doeth many miracles." Speaking about Jesus, this man does many miracles. "And if we let him thus alone, all men will believe on him. And the Romans shall come and take away both our place and nation." I want you to notice something here. I'm going to circle the word "our." And to understand why I'm doing that, you need a little historical background here. These Jewish leaders, these Pharisees and the chief priests and the people who are gathered together in this council here, they were Jewish leaders. They ruled over Jewish affairs, but they did so under Roman authority. The Romans gave them some latitude to govern as they and the Jewish law saw fit. But in fact, the Romans, they were the ones who were really in control. And in these verses here, you see what the Jewish leaders really care about by this unusual wording here in verse 48. At the end of verse 48, they say, the Romans shall come and take away both our place and nation. Our place there probably refers to the temple in Jerusalem. You see, what I'm trying to get you to see is these Jewish leaders in this council here, they're not concerned about the truth. They're not really even concerned about the Jewish people or about the Jewish nation. What they're really concerned about is it's their place and nation. They're concerned that there's going to be a populist uprising, and as a result, the Romans are going to take away the latitude that they had given this council to govern. That's what they're really concerned about. And from their perspective, they're right to be concerned about that. The Jews had lost their autonomy several times over the past 3 centuries. But notice in all of this what they don't do. They get together and they're concerned that the Romans are going to come and take away their latitude to govern. But notice what they don't do. They don't deny the miracles. They say here in verse 47, for this man doeth many miracles. No one at this time denied that Lazarus was dead and that Jesus rose him from the dead. Not even his main opponents here, the Pharisees. They don't deny that. You see, they knew the facts of what happened. They knew the truth of what those facts represented. They just didn't accept the truth. They cared more about their power than they did for the truth and for who Jesus is. Again, our place and nation, that our there really indicates that. Now their leader speaks up. So look at verse 49 here. And one of them, named Caiaphas, being the high priest that same year, said unto them, ye know nothing at all. He's very rude towards them here. Nor consider that it is expedient for us, and notice that same type of language here. It is expedient for us, again, they're only concerned about what's best for them. Okay? Nor consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perish not. Again, he's not thinking about the truth or really what's best for the people. He's thinking about what's best for us, speaking in the council. He's thinking about what's best for their power. Now, the next verses, a couple verses here, he makes a really interesting statement here. Look at verses 51 and 52. And this he spake not of himself, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus should die for that nation. And not for that nation only, not for the Jews only, but that he also should gather together in one the children of God that were scattered abroad. You see, this evil Caiaphas here, now he's only thinking about, he and the council, they're only thinking about their place in nation. They're only thinking about what's expedient for them. But in fact, he's more right than he realized. You see, Caiaphas and this council, they thought they were in control. They thought they were the one who had the place in the nation, and they thought they had the power to do what was expedient for them. But in fact, God was in control. And the same is true today. God is still in control. Jesus would in fact die for that nation, as he says here. And not just for that nation, as John elucidates here, but he in fact would die to take away the sin of the entire world. You see, the Bible tells us we've all sinned. We've all done things that God has told us not to do and failed to do things God has told us to do. And the Bible also tells us that the penalty for that sin is death, spiritual death, eternal separation from God. If we don't do something about our sin, we're going to die. We're going to die a spiritual death. But the Bible goes on to say we can have everlasting life. We can have that death penalty paid for by believing in him. You see, we owed a death payment. He paid a death payment. A death payment not just for that nation only, not just for the Jews, but for everyone who will believe in him. For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. You can have his death payment, the death payment he paid, applied to you if you'll stop trusting in whatever else you're trusting in and start trusting in him and the death payment he paid. What Caiaphas said here when he said it's expedient that one should die for the people, yeah, he was right. He was more right than he realized. One did die for the people. Jesus died and paid the sin payment for anyone who will believe in him. Now we keep reading here, and some really ugly stuff happens here. Look at verse 53. Then from that day forth they took counsel together for to put him to death. Jesus therefore walked no more openly among the Jews, but went thence unto a country near to the wilderness, into a city called Ephraim, and there continued with his disciples. He and his disciples, they went into hiding, so to speak, but only for a while. Verse 55, and the Jews' Passover was nigh at hand, and many went out of the country up to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. The Passover was one of the feasts where the Jews were commanded in the law to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to offer sacrifices to worship the Lord. And in verse 56, then sought they for Jesus, and spake among themselves as they stood in the temple, what think ye, that he will not come to the feast? Now both the chief priests and the Pharisees had given a commandment, that if any man knew where Jesus was, he should show it, that they might take him. Essentially, they add Jesus to Israel's most wanted list. And so we see here at the end of chapter 11, this is the first reaction to Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, and it's an evil reaction. It's the reaction of these Jewish leaders. You see, they understood exactly what Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, they understood exactly what it meant. They understood that he was God, he was the only one who has the power to raise people from the dead. But they rejected what it meant. So that's an evil reaction, a faithless reaction. Now when we get into chapter 12, then we get the next reaction. The next reaction's better. Look down here at the beginning of chapter 12. Then Jesus, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany, where Lazarus, which had been dead, where Lazarus was, which had been dead, whom he raised from the dead. So some time has passed since the end of chapter 11. We don't know exactly how much, but now Jesus is back in Bethany. Remember, Bethany's near Jerusalem. So he's back in Judea, where these people are looking to kill him. And it's only 6 days before the Passover, so we're getting right up close to right into the final week now, before his death. And then verse 2, there they made him a supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of them that sat at the table with him. You see, this is a new chapter. It's the start of chapter 12, but it's very much connected with the previous chapter. These are the same people, the same pair of sisters. Martha we see in verse 2. We're going to read about Mary down here in verse 3. And then their brother Lazarus. This is the same pair of sisters and brother whom Jesus loved, as we saw last time in the last video in the previous chapter. All right, now look at verse 3. Verse 3 is kind of the key verse I want to look at today. So once they get together at this supper, verse 3, then took Mary a pound of ointment of spikenard, very costly, and anointed the feet of Jesus. And wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the odor of the ointment. I want to park here on this verse for a few minutes because there's a lot to learn from what Mary of Bethany does here. And we want to learn as much from this as we can. So the first thing I want you to notice here, down here at the bottom of the previous page, so the ointment that Mary takes, this pound of ointment, this pound of spikenard ointment that Mary takes, notice here, it was very costly. It was very costly. For a common laborer, it would have costed about a year's worth of wages to buy a pound of spikenard ointment. the nard plant that was used to produce this spikenard ointment, it grew in India. So this ointment had to be imported from far away. That's one of the reasons it was so expensive. And so to convert this to our terms, so think about whatever salary you make in a year. Think of buying something for that amount of money and giving it to the Lord. That's what Mary was doing here. She was giving something that would have cost her an entire year's salary in order to buy. She's giving something that is very expensive. And the lesson to be learned here is that serving and worshiping the Lord, that shouldn't be something we do with our spare time. Okay? Not just something we do when we have the chance. The offering plate at church shouldn't be something where we just put in our spare change. The Lord deserves more than that. He deserves things that are very costly. The Lord deserves our best. If you're going to do something for the Lord, it should cost you something. One person who understood that was David, King David, from the Old Testament. Let me write you a reference here and we'll take a look at it. We're going to take a look at 2 Samuel chapter 24, verses 21 through 24. 2 Samuel chapter 24, verses 21 through 24. So let's go back and look at that here in the Old Testament. David's getting near the end of his reign. And earlier in that chapter, earlier in 2 Samuel chapter 24, David had disobeyed the Lord in taking a census. And because of that, the Lord had sent pestilence on the land, on the nation that he was governing over. He sent a pestilence that killed a lot of people. And that pestilence was stayed over the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite in Jerusalem. And because the pestilence was stayed to worship the Lord for the mercy that he had from staying the pestilence, David wants to build an altar and offer sacrifices to worship the Lord for the mercy he had shown. And notice what he says here. So in 2 Samuel chapter 24, look at verse 24. And the king, and that's King David, said unto Ornan, nay, so Ornan offers to give it to him. And he says to him, nay, but I will surely buy it of thee at a price. And then notice what he says here. Neither will I offer burnt offerings unto the Lord my God of that which doth cost me nothing. I'm not going to offer something to the Lord that doesn't cost me something. Okay? And so David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver. See, David understood, and we need to understand that if you're going to do something for the Lord, or if you're going to give something to the Lord, it needs to cost you something. It costs me things to run this project, parking full time. It costs me both money and it costs me some other things as well. But what you give to him, it needs to be something of value to you. And if it's not something of value to you, then it's not really service and it's not really worship. The thing that David gives here and the thing that Mary gives to the Lord, she gave the ointment that she gave to the Lord. It was costly ointment. It costed her a lot. But in her mind, he was worth it. Something very costly, but he's worth it. So back here in John, I want you to notice that. I pointed out the cost of her worship. But I want you to notice a couple of other things, and they're over here at the top of the next page. Right? So first of all, I want you to notice that the thing that she anoints, where she pours the ointment, she pours them on his feet. She anoints his feet. Okay? That's pointed out here at the top of this page. It's also given down at the bottom of the previous page. It says that she takes the pound of spikenard ointment, the very costly ointment, and anointed the feet of Jesus. Anointed the feet of Jesus. This would have been unusual. To anoint someone's feet would have been unusual in what she does here. It was unusual in a couple of ways. First of all, if you anoint someone, if you anoint them to be king or priest, it's done many times in the Bible. But when you anoint someone with oil, normally you would anoint their head, not their feet. Okay. Working on someone's feet, that was a servant's job. That wasn't an anointer's job. So when she anoints his feet, and then after she anoints his feet, it tells us up here at the top of the next page, she wiped his feet with her hair. She's doing the work of a servant. She's being a servant here. So not only is there worship involved, there's service involved. And the other thing I want you to notice here, so the thing that she uses to wipe his feet, she wipes his feet with her hair. She wipes his feet with her hair. In their culture, a woman generally didn't unbind her hair in public. It would have been rude and untoward for a woman to do that. There's an interesting reference that we don't normally think of, or at least I never really thought of in connection with what Mary does here. Until I started studying this passage for this video. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 15. Okay, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 15. It's a passage we don't really look at that much because it contains a lot of things that are specific to the Corinthian culture. But it gives us an insight here to Mary's culture as well. So let's take a look at this. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 15. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And notice what it says here about a woman and her hair. And again, we don't look at this too often. This has to do with head coverings and things that are specific to the Corinthian culture. But notice what it says here. It says, "But if a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given her for a covering." It says that here, it's a glory to her. So what we see is Mary giving her everything to Jesus. She gives her money in the spikenard ointment, the very costly ointment. She gives her service in working on his feet. And she gives her glory in the fact that she's using her hair. Again, her woman's long hair, it's a glory to her. That's the way they thought about it back in their culture. She's giving to Jesus everything she has. She knew who he was, and she knew he's worth everything she had. She gives him her money. She gives him her service. She gives him her glory. And if you believed in him, you know who he is. You know he is in fact worth everything you have. He's worth your money. He's worth your service. He's worth your glory. He's worth everything you have. Now, back in John here, back in John chapter 12, we see next some people who didn't take the approach that Mary did. Some people didn't appreciate what Mary was doing here. Look at verse 4 of chapter 12. "Then saith one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, which should betray him, why was not this ointment sold for 300 pence? Again, it could have been sold for a large amount. It was very costly ointment and given to the poor. And then John gives us an editorial note here. This he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the bag and bare what was put therein. When it talks about the bag here, it means the money bag. He took care of the money that the disciples used to buy food and supplies. At the time, if they trusted Judas Iscariot with the money bag, they must have thought he was reliable. And later they learned he wasn't. Later they learned he was a traitor, and he would be one of the 12 disciples who would betray him. And also that he was a thief. John tells us specifically he was a thief and a traitor here. Okay? But notice Jesus' rebuke to him here. Verse 7, "So then said Jesus, Let her alone. Against the day of my burying hath she kept this. For the poor always ye have with you, but me ye have always." Jesus tells them that what Mary did, Mary giving everything she had to him, giving her money, giving her service, giving her glory, he tells her, no, that's the right thing to do. Okay? And then verse 9, "Much people of the Jews therefore knew that he was there. And they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might see Lazarus also, whom he had raised from the dead." They want to see the evidence. Okay? But the chief priests consulted that they might put Lazarus also to death, because that by reason of him, by reason of Lazarus, many of the Jews went away and believed on Jesus. Now, notice how evil just seeps out here and just tries to control everything. Back in the previous chapter, back in chapter 11, verse 50, this Caiaphas, he says, "Nor consider it that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people." Before, they had only talked about killing one man, namely Jesus. Now, they want to kill Lazarus too. Okay. Chapter 12 here and verse 11. Okay. Or verse 10, sorry, chapter 12 and verse 10. But the chief priests consulted that they might put Lazarus also to death. It used to be they would just want to kill one person. Now they want to kill two people, both Jesus and Lazarus. And why did they want to kill Lazarus? I mean, Lazarus hadn't done or said anything against them like Jesus had. Or at least if Lazarus had done or said some things against them, it's not recorded in Scripture. But Lazarus being raised from the dead was clear, irrefutable evidence of who Jesus is. And they understood that. They knew they had to destroy the evidence. That's why they wanted to kill him too. So we've seen two reactions so far to Lazarus being raised from the dead. We've seen the Jewish leaders' reaction, it's an evil, faithless one. We've seen Mary's reaction, it's one of service and worship. And then finally, last bit of text we're going to look at for today, we have one more reaction coming up here. It's the reaction of the Jewish people at large. Look down here in verse 12. On the next day, so the day after he had this supper with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, on the next day, much people that were come to the feast, when they heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, took branches of palm trees. Now notice here, these are people who were come to the feast. So these are Jews who had come to Jerusalem to worship, to observe the feast of the Passover. And notice what these people at large do. These Jews doing their pilgrimage to Jerusalem to observe the Passover feast, as they were commanded. Notice what they do, verse 13. They took branches of palm trees and went forth to meet him, and cried, "Hosanna! Blessed is the King of Israel, that cometh in the name of the Lord." Now, there's some deep symbolism here. Palm trees in the Bible represent victory. So I'm going to underline palm trees. I'm going to write victory over top of that. Okay. Whenever you see palm trees in the Bible, that's symbolic of victory. And this thing they cried here, the thing they cried, Hosanna, that is a word, it means save now. So I'll write that in beside here. Save now. They bring symbols of victory. They bring palm trees. And they cry, Hosanna, save now. And what they do here and what they cry when they say, Hosanna, blessed is the King of Israel that cometh in the name of the Lord. What they're really doing, they're quoting one of the Psalms. And so I'll write this reference in. I'm not going to look at it, but I'll write the reference in here. They're quoting Psalm chapter 118, verses 25 and 26. Okay. Psalm 118, verses 25 through 26. And I'm not going to turn there, but if you look at Psalm 118 in verse 25 starts with a phrase, save now. Well, that phrase is Hosanna. It's the same word. You see, these people here, these people who had come to the feast, and these people who start waving branches of victory in front of Jesus and start crying to him, save now, these people, they realize who he is. They realize he's the Messiah, the Savior and King of Israel, the one sent from God, the one who comes in the name of the Lord. But these people, they're not worshiping him like Mary was. They're not interested in serving and worshiping him and giving him everything they have. They're not interested in that. What they're interested in is saving the nation. They're interested in political victory over the Romans. Now, you have to cut them a little bit of slack here because, again, he is the King of Israel. He is exactly who they think he is. In fact, he's more than the King of Israel. He's the King of Kings. He's going to give Israel political victory over the Romans and the entire Gentile world, but not yet. See, the first time Jesus came into this world, he didn't come to give them political victory. He didn't come as the King of Kings and the King of Israel. He came to die on the cross, to pay for the sins of the world, not to give them political victory. So their reaction here to Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, their reaction was right, but it was just mistimed and misguided. Now let's look at the rest of this text here. So then verse 14. Okay. And then we'll move into our prayer time segment for today. So verse 14, so when this happens, so it says, "And Jesus, when he had found a young ass, sat thereon," a young donkey, "sat thereon, as it is written, Fear not, daughter of Zion, behold thy king cometh, sitting on an ass's colt," sitting on a young donkey. I'll write in another reference here I'm not going to look at. Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. Okay. Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. I've read that Zechariah is the most underpreached book in the Bible, and sometimes we tend to neglect the Old Testament prophets. We tend to think that they're just a bunch of doom and gloom, and there is a lot of that in the Old Testament prophets. But those Old Testament prophets, they knew some things. They knew what was going to happen. All of their prophecies, they either have been or will be fulfilled. We need to pay attention to the prophets here. And then notice the disciples' reaction to what goes on here, verse 16. "These things understood not his disciples at first, but when Jesus was glorified, then remembered they," after he died and rose again, "then remembered they that these things were written of him, and that they had done these things unto him." So later on, they put the pieces together here. And then verse 17, "The people therefore that was with him when he called Lazarus out of his grave and raised him from the dead bear record. For this cause the people also met him, for that they heard that he had done this miracle." John makes it very clear here in verse 18 that this, what is sometimes called the triumphal entry, it happened because of the miracle, because Jesus had risen Lazarus from the dead. And then last verse for today, verse 19. "The Pharisees therefore said among themselves, Perceive ye how ye prevail nothing? Behold, the whole world is gone after him." Now that's both exasperation and exaggeration on their part. But just to summarize here, we see in this text here 3 responses to Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. The Jewish leaders, the Pharisees and the other Jewish leaders, they respond with rejection. That's an evil, faithless response. Mary responds with service and worship. Mary responds by giving him everything that she has, giving him her money, giving him her service, giving them her glory. Everything she has, Mary gives it to her, gives it to Jesus. The people at large, they respond opportunistically. They want political victory. They want to see what kind of political salvation over the Romans they can get from this. The big question is, how are you going to respond? See, none of these people, even these Pharisees who want to kill him and want to kill Lazarus, none of them doubted the miracle, and there's no reason to. The issue is, how will you respond to this miracle? How will you respond to the resurrection and the life? We'll look at the rest of John chapter 12 next time. I close this in every video with a brief prayer time. You can email prayer requests to parkingfulltime@gmail.com. And some things I'm praying for right now. I'm praying for our country and its leaders. We desperately need that right now. I pray that more people will believe in him, the more people will consider the evidence and choose to trust in him because of the evidence. I'm praying for power and protection for preachers of the gospel. There were a lot of people out to kill people like Jesus and Lazarus back in his day, and that's still the case, especially in some parts of the world today. And I'm praying that new believers will grow. New believers will grow to trust him more and to become preachers of the gospel. So I'm going to take a few minutes to pray for these things. I hope you will as well. Until next time, I am Big Dave, the Parks Professor for Parking Full Time. Have a great afternoon. Take care, and Lord bless.